I never thought I'd be the one to rock the boat, you know? Growing up in a small town just outside of Manchester, I was always the quiet one, the dependable one. My parents, bless their hearts, were hardworking folk who instilled in me the value of family above all else. So when I married John and we settled into our own little corner of the world, I threw myself into creating the perfect home with every ounce of energy I had. Our house on Willow Lane wasn't much to look at from the outside, but inside, it was my canvas. I spent countless hours scouring charity shops and flea markets, hunting for those special pieces that would make our house a home. There was the vintage clock I found in Stockport, its face slightly tarnished, but still keeping perfect time. The well-worn leather armchair that I reupholstered myself, learning from YouTube videos late into the night after John and the kids had gone to bed. Each item had a story, a piece of my heart poured into it. I remember the day I finally hung the last curtain in our living room. The sunlight filtered through the delicate lace, casting intricate shadows on the hardwood floor I'd painstakingly refinished. I stood there, dust cloth in hand, feeling a sense of pride wash over me. This was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary I'd built for my family, a place where memories would be made and cherished. But as the years went by, that pride began to curdle into something darker. It started small, you see. An offhand comment from my mother-in-law about the quaint decor. My sister's raised eyebrow when I mentioned spending a weekend repainting the kitchen instead of joining her for a girls' trip to London. Even John, bless him, would sometimes walk through the front door with barely a glance at the fresh flowers I'd arranged or the new throw pillows I'd stayed up half the night sewing. I told myself it didn't matter, that the warmth in my children's laughter as they played in the garden I'd so carefully tended was reward enough. That the way John's shoulders would relax as he sank into his favorite chair after a long day at the factory was all the recognition I needed. But deep down, a small voice whispered that I deserved more. That my sacrifices, my dedication, my love poured into every nook and cranny of our home should be seen and appreciated. As time wore on, that whisper grew louder. I'd wake up at dawn to prepare a full English breakfast, the kitchen filled with the aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed tea. But more often than not, the family would rush through, grabbing a slice of toast or a granola bar as they dashed out the door. The carefully laid table, the homemade jam, the perfectly poached eggs, all left untouched and unnoticed. Weekends became a blur of ferrying the kids to football practice and dance recitals, of scrubbing grass stains out of jerseys and mending torn leotards. I'd sit on the sidelines, cheering them on, my heart swelling with pride at their accomplishments. But when it came time for the end-of-season dinners or the dance company parties, it was always John who got the nod of approval from the other parents. "You must be so proud," they'd say to him, as if the hours of practice, the emotional support, the behind-the-scenes work was all his doing. Don't get me wrong, I loved my family fiercely. Every bedtime story read, every scraped knee kissed better, every homework assignment puzzled over together. These were the moments that gave my life meaning. But as the years rolled by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was fading into the background of my own life. That the very people I dedicated myself to saw me as little more than a fixture, as reliable and unremarkable as the kitchen sink. It was the little things that started to grate. The way John would toss his dirty clothes on the floor, mere inches from the laundry basket. The children's toys left scattered across the living room, despite the carefully organized storage system I'd put in place. The half-empty mugs of tea abandoned on every surface, leaving rings on the furniture I'd so lovingly restored. I tried to speak up, to assert myself. "It would mean a lot to me if you could put your dishes in the sink," I'd say, or "I spent hours tidying up. Could you please try to keep it that way?" But my words seemed to evaporate into thin air, met with distracted nods or vague promises that never quite materialized into action. As our eldest, Emily, entered her teenage years, the disconnect grew even more pronounced. She'd roll her eyes at my suggestions for family game nights or Sunday roasts, preferring to lock herself in her room with her phone and her friends' voices chattering through the speaker. I'd stand outside her door, a plate of her favorite biscuits in hand, feeling like a stranger in my own home. John, for his part, seemed to retreat further into his work. He'd come home later and later, his mind still at the office even when his body was slumped in front of the telly. Our conversations became perfunctory, limited to the logistics of running a household rather than the dreams and aspirations we'd once shared. It was during one of those rare quiet moments, as I sat alone in the kitchen nursing a cup of tea long gone cold, that I realized how deep the resentment had grown. The house around me, once a source of such pride and joy, now felt like a gilded cage. Every polished surface, every carefully arranged vignette seemed to mock me with its perfection, a stark contrast to the messiness of my emotions. I found myself wondering what it would be like to just leave. To walk out the door and not look back. To go somewhere where I wasn't defined by my role as wife and mother, where my worth wasn't measured in loads of laundry done or meals cooked. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. But I couldn't do it. The ties that bound me to this life, to this family, were too strong. Even as the resentment gnawed at me, my love for them remained unshakable. So I stayed, continuing to pour myself into creating a home that seemed to go unappreciated, hoping against hope that someday someone would see me, really see me, and understand the depth of what I'd given. Little did I know that the seeds of change had already been planted. That the quiet resentment I'd been nurturing was about to blossom into something that would shake the very foundations of our family. As I stood there in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my unacknowledged labor, I had no idea that events were already in motion that would force us all to confront the injustices that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted me from my reverie. John was home. And with him, the usual whirlwind of activity that marked our evenings. As I moved to reheat his dinner, plastering on the smile that had become second nature, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had to give. That the careful balance I'd maintained for so long was teetering on the edge of collapse. But for now, I pushed those thoughts aside. There were mouths to feed, homework to oversee, a household to run. The confrontation that was brewing would have to wait. Little did I know how soon it would come, or how profoundly it would change everything I thought I knew about my place in this family. The invitation to the family gathering had been sitting on our mantelpiece for weeks, a seemingly innocuous piece of cardstock that filled me with a mix of dread and anticipation. It was for my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, a milestone that demanded celebration. Under normal circumstances, I would have thrown myself into the preparations, but this time, something felt different. As the day approached, I found myself standing in front of my wardrobe, deliberating over what to wear. It was a small thing, really, but it felt monumental. I finally settled on a navy blue dress I'd bought years ago for a cousin's wedding. It still fit, though a bit more snugly than before. As I smoothed it down, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked tired, the lines around her eyes a little deeper than I remembered. "Mom, have you seen my football boots?" The shout from downstairs jolted me back to reality. Our youngest, Tommy, had a match later that afternoon. I'd have to leave the gathering early to get him there on time. Just another juggling act in the endless circus of family life. The drive to my parents' house in Altrincham was tense. John was quiet, his mind already on the work he'd be returning to on Monday. Emily had her headphones in, lost in her own world. Only Tommy seemed excited, chattering away about his upcoming match. As we pulled up to the familiar red brick house, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Cars lined the street. It looked like the whole extended family had turned out. I took a deep breath, plastered on a smile, and stepped out of the car. The house was a cacophony of voices and laughter as we entered. Aunts, uncles, cousins, faces I hadn't seen in years mingled with those I'd rather forget. I made my way through the crowd, accepting hugs and kisses, making small talk about the weather and how much the children had grown. It was as I was hanging up our coats that I overheard the conversation that would change everything. "Where should we put Sarah's lot?" It was my mother's voice coming from the dining room. "Oh, I don't think there's room for all of them at the main table." My father's reply was dismissive. "Just put John and the kids there. Sarah can sit with Aunt Marge in the kitchen." I froze, my hand still on Tommy's jacket. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. After all these years, All the work I'd put into being the perfect daughter, the perfect mother, and this was how they saw me? An afterthought, someone to be tucked away out of sight? I must have made a sound because suddenly my mother was there, all smiles and forced cheer. "Sarah, love. So glad you could make it. Your brother's just arrived with his brood. Aren't they getting big?" I nodded mutely, not trusting myself to speak. Over her shoulder, I could see my younger brother, Mark, holding court in the living room. His wife, Lisa, stood beside him, their 3 children, all under 5, running circles around their legs. The perfect family tableau. As if reading my thoughts, my mother leaned in conspiratorially. "Aren't they just adorable? You know, your father and I were thinking it might be nice to have them stay for a few days after the party. The little ones are just at such a cute age." Each word was like a twist of the knife. I thought of Tommy, of the hours I'd spent helping him with his reading, of the special breakfasts I made to tempt his picky appetite. I thought of Emily, no longer little, but still needing her mum in ways she'd never admit. And I thought of Jamie, my middle child, who wasn't here because he was different, because he didn't fit into this picture of family perfection. Jamie, with his gentle soul and his struggles to fit in. Jamie, who my parents had subtly but persistently suggested might be better off in a special school, away from the family, away from their carefully cultivated image. Jamie, who was spending the weekend with John's sister because I'd been too cowardly to insist he be included in this gathering. The shame of it crashed over me, mingling with the anger and hurt until I could barely breathe. How had I let it come to this? How had I become so complicit in my own erasure? "Sarah? Are you all right, love? You look a bit peaky." My mother's voice seemed to come from far away. I blinked, focusing on her concerned face. "I'm fine," I managed to say, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Just a bit of a headache. I think I'll get some air." I pushed past her, ignoring her calls, and made my way to the back garden. The late afternoon sun was warm on my face as I gulped in deep breaths, trying to steady myself. From inside, I could hear the rise and fall of voices, laughter punctuated by the shrieks of playing children. My family, my life, and I was standing outside of it all, as surely as I was standing outside this house. "Mummy?" Tommy's voice startled me. He was standing in the doorway, a concerned look on his young face. "Are you okay? Grandma said you weren't feeling well." I looked at my son, really looked at him. His hair was sticking up in the back, resisting all attempts at combing. There was a smudge of dirt on his cheek, probably from the football he'd been kicking around in the garden earlier. His blue eyes, so like his father's, were wide with worry. In that moment, something shifted inside me. This beautiful, imperfect child was mine. He was real, he was here, and he needed me. Not some idealized version of a mother, not the perfect daughter or sister or wife I'd been trying so hard to be. He needed me, Sarah, with all my flaws and fears and fierce, uncompromising love. "I'm okay, love," I said, holding out my arms. He came to me without hesitation, burying his face in my stomach. I held him close, breathing in the scent of grass and sunshine that clung to his hair. "Is Jamie coming later?" he asked, his voice muffled against my dress. The innocent question nearly undid me. "No, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick. "Jamie's staying with Aunt Beth this weekend, remember?" Tommy pulled back, frowning. "But why? It's Grandma and Grandpa's party. He should be here." Out of the mouths of babes, as they say. In that moment, I saw with perfect clarity the injustice I had allowed to fester. Not just to myself, but to my children, all of my children. "You're right," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "He should be here. And that's my fault for not insisting on it." Tommy looked up at me, confusion clear on his face. But before he could ask any more questions, we were interrupted by my father's booming voice. "There you are," he said, coming out into the garden. "We're about to cut the cake. Come on in, everyone's waiting." I looked at him, this man who had loomed so large in my life, who had shaped so much of who I was with his expectations and his casual dismissals. And for the first time, I saw him clearly. Not as the all-powerful father figure, but as a flawed human being. One who had made choices, just as I had. choices that had led us to this moment. "We'll be right there," I said, my voice steady. "I just need a moment with Tommy." My father's eyebrows rose in surprise. It wasn't like me to delay, to not immediately jump to attention. But he nodded, turning back to the house. I knelt down in front of Tommy, looking him in the eye. "I need you to do something for me," I said. "I need you to go inside and tell your dad that we're leaving early. Tell him I'm not feeling well and we need to go pick up Jamie." "But what about my football match?" Tommy asked, his lower lip trembling slightly. I cupped his face in my hands, my heart swelling with love for the sweet, unselfish boy. "We'll make it to your match," I promised. "But first, we're going to bring your brother home, where he belongs." Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding in some instinctive way that this was important. As he ran back into the house, I straightened up, smoothing down my dress. The chatter from inside seemed louder now, more grating. But for the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose, of rightness in my bones. I wasn't sure what would happen next. How my parents would react, how John would respond, what this would mean for our family dynamics. But I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I was done being silent. Done being the perfect, accommodating daughter and wife and mother. It was time to speak up, to stand up. For myself, for Jamie, for all of us who had been pushed to the margins of this family. As I walked back into the house, head held high, I felt the first stirrings of a long-dormant strength. The confrontation I had been avoiding for so long was coming, and this time I was ready for it. As I made my way back into the house, my mind was reeling from the decision I'd just made. The chatter and laughter that had seemed so oppressive just moments ago now felt distant, as if I was moving through a bubble of my own determination. I spotted John across the room, deep in conversation with my cousin Peter about some football match or other. Our eyes met, and I saw the question in his gaze. I gave a small nod, and he excused himself, making his way over to me. "Everything all right, love?" he asked, his voice low. "Tommy said something about leaving early?" I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could get a word out, my mother appeared at my elbow, all smiles and barely concealed anxiety. "Sarah, dear, there you are. We're just about to start the speeches." "Your father's been asking for you," she said, her hand already on my arm to guide me towards the dining room. I gently but firmly removed her hand. "Mom, I need to talk to John for a moment." "We'll be right there." The flash of surprise on her face was quickly masked, but I saw it. It wasn't like me to push back, even in this small way. "Well, don't be too long," she said, her smile a bit strained now. "You know how your father gets when things don't go to plan." As she bustled away, I turned back to John. "We need to leave," I said quietly. "I want to go get Jamie." John's eyebrows shot up. "Now?" But the party's barely started. "And what about Tommy's match?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "John, I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend that it's okay for our son to be excluded like this. We'll make it to Tommy's match, I promise. But first, we need to bring Jamie home." I could see the conflict on John's face. He'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over when family tensions arose. But I also saw understanding dawning in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "All right, love. If you're sure this is what you want to do." Relief washed over me. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed his support until that moment. "It is," I said firmly. "Can you get the kids ready?" "I'll make our excuses to Mom and Dad." As John moved away to collect Emily and Tommy, I squared my shoulders and headed towards the dining room. I could hear my father's voice, loud and jovial, regaling the assembled family with some story or other. I paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. The long dining table was beautifully set, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier overhead. My parents sat at the head of the table, my father holding court while my mother beamed at his side. My brother Mark and his wife Lisa were seated near them, their children occupying 3 high chairs wedged in between. The rest of the extended family filled out the table, aunts and uncles and cousins I hadn't seen in years. And there, at the far end of the table, was an empty chair. My chair, I realized with a start. Tucked away in the corner, as if an afterthought. As if sensing my presence, my father looked up, his face breaking into a broad smile. "Ah, there she is," he boomed. "Come in, Sarah love. We were just about to toast to family." The irony of his words hit me like a physical blow. Family. As if Jamie wasn't family. As if I wasn't family unless I was filling the role they'd assigned me. I must have hesitated a moment too long because my father's smile faltered slightly. "Sarah? Everything all right?" I felt all eyes turn to me, curiosity and concern mingling in their gazes. This was it, I realized. The moment of truth. I could smile and nod, take my seat at the far end of the table, and continue as we always had. Or I could speak up. I thought of Jamie, probably watching telly at Aunt Beth's right now, wondering why he wasn't with us. I thought of Tommy, his innocent question about why his brother wasn't here. I thought of all the times I'd bitten my tongue, swallowed my hurt, in the name of keeping the peace. "No," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "No, everything is not all right." A hush fell over the room. I could see my mother's eyes widen in alarm, my father's brow furrowing. In confusion, but I pressed on. "I'm sorry, but John and I need to leave. We're going to pick up Jamie and take him to Tommy's football match." For a moment, there was silence. Then my father let out a forced chuckle. "Now, Sarah, don't be silly. Jamie's fine where he is. This is a family celebration." "Jamie is family," I said, my voice gaining strength. "He's as much a part of this family as any of us. And he should be here." I saw a flicker of something, guilt? Shame? Cross my father's face before he masked it with a jovial smile. "Of course he is, love. We just thought, well, with all the noise and excitement, it might be a bit much for him. You know how he gets in crowds." "That's not your decision to make," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "It's ours. Mine and John's. And we should have been the ones to decide if it was too much for him." My mother stood up, her face a picture of concern. "Sarah, dear, let's not do this now. It's a celebration. Why don't you sit down, have a glass of champagne? We can talk about this later." But I was beyond being soothed or silenced. Years of pent-up frustration and hurt were bubbling to the surface, and I couldn't hold them back any longer. "No, Mum. We need to talk about this now. Because it's not just about today. It's about every time you've made Jamie feel less than, every time you've pushed him to the sidelines. It's about the way you treat all of us, really." I could see the shock on the faces around the table. This wasn't the Sarah they knew, the quiet, agreeable Sarah who never made waves. But I wasn't that Sarah anymore. "What do you mean, the way we treat all of you?" my father asked, his voice low and dangerous. "We've given you everything. This house, the holidays, the best schools for the kids. What more could you want?" And there it was, the crux of the matter. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "What I want," I said slowly, "is for you to see us. Really see us. Not as extensions of yourselves, not as ornaments to be arranged at your perfect family gatherings, but as people, with our own needs, our own struggles, our own lives." I could see my words hitting home. My mother's face had gone pale, my father's red with a mix of anger and embarrassment. Around the table, aunts and uncles and cousins shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly very interested in their napkins or glasses. "I want you to see Jamie for the wonderful, unique boy he is, not as a problem to be managed or hidden away. I want you to see Emily and Tommy as individuals, not just as the good grandchildren who fit your mold. And I want you to see me, not as the perfect daughter you think you raised, but as the woman I've become, with all my flaws and strengths." My voice broke a little on the last words, and I felt a hand slip into mine. John had appeared at my side, Emily and Tommy flanking him. I squeezed his hand gratefully, drawing strength from his presence. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the muffled sounds of cars passing on the street outside. I could see the wheels turning in my parents' minds, see them struggling to process this sudden upheaval in their carefully ordered world. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "Sarah," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I don't understand where this is coming from. We've always supported you, always been there for you. Have you? I asked quietly. Or have you been there for the version of me that you wanted to see? The one who never complained, never asked for anything, never disrupted your perfect family narrative. I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the first hint that maybe, just maybe, my words were getting through. My mother stood up, smoothing down her dress in a nervous gesture I recognized all too well. Perhaps, she said, her voice trembling slightly, perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. The rest of the family doesn't need to dash. The rest of the family needs to hear this, I interrupted gently. Because it's not just about us. It's about the way we all treat each other. The expectations we put on each other. The love we withhold when someone doesn't meet those expectations. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of aunts and uncles and cousins I'd known all my life. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful. A few, I was surprised to see, were nodding slightly. I'm not asking for much, I continued. Just for us to be honest with each other. To accept each other as we are, not as we wish each other to be. To make room at the table, literally and figuratively, for all of us. Including Jamie. As if on cue, Tommy piped up. Can we go get Jamie now, Mom? I want him to see me play football. I smiled down at my son, feeling a surge of love and pride. Yes, love. We're going to get Jamie now. I turned back to my parents, who were standing now, looking lost and a little shell-shocked. We'll be back, I said softly. All of us. If you'll have us. And with that, we turned and walked out of the dining room, out of the house that had been the scene of so many family dramas, big and small. As we stepped into the afternoon sunlight, I felt as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew. There would be more conversations, more confrontations. But for the first time in years, I felt hope. Hope for change, hope for understanding, hope for a family that could truly see and accept each other. As we got into the car, John reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, he said simply. And in that moment, I realized that was all I'd ever really wanted. Not approval or perfection, but the simple acknowledgement of who I was and what I'd done. We pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the house with its tension and unspoken resentments. Ahead of us lay an uncertain future, but one we would face together. As a family. All of us. The drive to Aunt Beth's house was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. John kept shooting me concerned glances, but I was too wrapped up in my own swirling emotions to offer much reassurance. Emily had her headphones in, as usual, but I noticed her watching me in the rearview mirror, a mix of confusion and something that might have been respect in her eyes. Tommy, bless him, was chattering away about his upcoming football match, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the car. As we pulled up to Beth's tidy semi-detached in Didsbury, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. What would I say to Jamie? How could I explain why we'd left him behind, why we were only now coming to get him? I'll go, John said softly, unbuckling his seatbelt. But I shook my head. No, I need to do this, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I got out of the car and walked up the short path to the front door, each step feeling like it took monumental effort. Before I could even ring the bell, the door swung open. Jamie stood there, his face lighting up at the sight of me. Mom, he exclaimed, throwing his arms around my waist. I thought you weren't coming until tomorrow. I hugged him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair. Change of plans, love, I managed to say past the lump in my throat. How do you fancy coming to watch Tommy's football match? Jamie pulled back, his brow furrowing in that way that always made him look older than his years. But what about Grandma and Grandpa's party? I thought that's where you were today. I knelt down so we were eye to eye, my hands on his shoulders. We were, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. But we realized that it wasn't right for you not to be there. You're just as much a part of this family as anyone else, Jamie. And I'm sorry it took us so long to remember that. I saw the flicker of hurt in his eyes, quickly replaced by hope. Really? He asked, his voice small. You want me there? More than anything, I said firmly. Now, go grab your things. We've got a football match to get to. As Jamie ran off to collect his bag, Aunt Beth appeared in the hallway. She gave me a knowing look. About time, she said simply. I nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude for this woman who had always seen Jamie for who he was, not for who others thought he should be. Thank you, I said. For everything. She waved off my thanks. Just make sure you keep standing up for him, she said. And for yourself. The drive to the football pitch was livelier now, with Jamie and Tommy chattering excitedly in the back seat. As we pulled into the car park, I saw my parents' car already there. My heart sank. Of course they'd come. They never missed one of Tommy's matches. You okay? John asked quietly as we got out of the car. I took a deep breath, watching as Jamie helped Tommy with his football boots. Yeah, I said, surprising myself with how true it felt. Yeah, I think I am. We made our way to the sidelines, where my parents were already seated in their usual spot. My mother's eyes widened at the sight of Jamie, while my father's face went carefully blank. Look who we brought, Tommy announced proudly, oblivious to the tension. Jamie's going to watch me play. My mother recovered first, pasting on a smile. That's lovely, dear, she said, her voice strained. Jamie, how nice to see you. Jamie, always sensitive to atmosphere, pressed closer to my side. I put an arm around him, drawing strength from his presence. Jamie wanted to support his brother, I said, my voice clear and steady. Just like the rest of the family. My father cleared his throat. Sarah, about earlier, but I cut him off. Not now, Dad. We're here to watch Tommy play. As the match got underway, I found myself hyper-aware of every interaction. The way my mother kept shooting nervous glances at Jamie, as if he might do something unpredictable at any moment. The way my father's jaw clenched every time Jamie cheered for Tommy, a little too loudly, a little too enthusiastically for his liking. But I also noticed other things. The genuine smile on Emily's face as she explained the offside rule to Jamie. The way John's hand found mine, squeezing it in silent support. The pride in Tommy's eyes when he looked over and saw his whole family there, cheering him on. As the final whistle blew, Tommy's team won 2-1, with Tommy scoring the winning goal. I knew we couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. While the boys were busy celebrating with their teammates, I turned to my parents. We need to talk, I said quietly. Properly this time. My mother looked like she wanted to protest, but my father nodded slowly. You're right, he said, his voice gruff. But not here. Come back to the house. We can talk there. The drive back to my parents' house felt surreal. The last time we'd made this journey, just hours ago, I'd been a different person. Or perhaps, I mused, I'd been the same person, just one who had finally found her voice. As we all filed into the living room, the remnants of the party still visible in the half-empty glasses and discarded party hats, I felt a surge of determination. This was it. The moment I'd been building towards for years, perhaps without even realizing it. Sit down, everyone, my father said, his voice lacking its usual authoritative boom. We arranged ourselves awkwardly, John and I on the sofa, Jamie wedged between us, Emily and Tommy perched on the arms. My parents took their usual chairs, looking suddenly old and uncertain. For a long moment, no one spoke. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed impossibly loud. Finally, my mother broke the silence. Sarah, dear, she began, her voice trembling slightly. We never meant to make any of you feel unwanted. I supplied when she trailed off. Unimportant? Like we didn't measure up to your expectations. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Now, Sarah, that's not fair. We've always wanted the best for you, for all of you. The best according to whom, Dad? I asked, feeling the familiar frustration rising. According to your standards? Your idea of what a perfect family should look like. We only wanted you to be happy, my mother interjected, wringing her hands. To have the best opportunities, to be normal? Jamie's small voice cut through the tension like a knife. We all turned to look at him, surprised. He rarely spoke up in family discussions, especially not with his grandparents. My mother's face crumpled. Oh, Jamie, no, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled Jamie closer to me, drawing strength from his presence. That's exactly it, though, isn't it? I said quietly. You've always been so focused on how things look, on living up to some ideal that you've never stopped to consider what we actually need. What makes us happy? My father opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. No, Dad, please. Let me finish. I've spent years trying to live up to your expectations. To be the perfect daughter, the perfect mother, to have the perfect family. And do you know what it's got me? A house full of resentment, children who feel like they can never quite measure up, and a constant feeling that I'm somehow failing. I took a deep breath, feeling John's hand on my back, steadying me. But today, when I stood up to you at the party, when I decided to go get Jamie and bring him where he belongs, with his family, I felt more like myself than I have in years. I looked around at my family, at John's proud smile, at Emily's wide-eyed attention, at Tommy's confused but supportive expression, at Jamie's hand gripping mine tightly. This is us, I said firmly. This is our family. Messy, imperfect, sometimes loud, sometimes struggling, but real. And it's time you accepted us for who we are, not who you want us to be. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the emotions playing across my parents' faces: shock, hurt, confusion, and maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of understanding. My father was the first to speak. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. We never realized. We thought we were doing what was best. We never meant to make you feel less than." "I know," I said softly, "but intention doesn't always match impact. And the impact has been, well, you've seen it today." My mother wiped at her eyes. "What do we do now?" she asked, sounding lost. I felt a surge of compassion for them then. They were products of their generation, of their own upbringing. Change wouldn't come easily or quickly. But the fact that they were asking, that they were here, listening, it was a start. "We start over," I said simply. "We talk, really talk. We listen to each other. We make space for all of us, with all our quirks and differences. And we remember that love, real love, isn't about meeting expectations or fitting some perfect mold. It's about acceptance, support, and celebrating each other for who we truly are." As I finished speaking, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Years of ingrained behaviors and expectations don't change overnight. But for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt hope. Hope for our family, hope for understanding, hope for a future where we could all be truly seen and accepted. Jamie's small hand squeezed mine, and I looked down to see him smiling up at me. "I love you, Mom," he said simply. And in that moment, I knew. Whatever came next, whatever challenges we faced, we would face them together. As a family. Imperfect, messy, but real. And finally, whole. The days following our family confrontation passed in a blur of tense phone calls and awkward encounters. It was as if we were all walking on eggshells, unsure of how to navigate this new terrain where long-held secrets and resentments had been laid bare. I found myself replaying our conversation in my parents' living room over and over, analyzing every word, every reaction. It was a Wednesday afternoon when things came to a head. I was in the kitchen, half-heartedly attempting to bake a Victoria sponge for the school fete when the doorbell rang. Wiping my flour-covered hands on my apron, I opened the door to find my mother standing there, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Mom," I said, surprise coloring my voice. "I wasn't expecting you." She gave me a tight smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I thought we should talk. Properly." I hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in. As she walked past me into the hallway, I caught a whiff of her familiar perfume, Chanel No. 5, the same scent she'd worn for as long as I could remember. It brought back a flood of memories, her tucking me into bed as a child, helping me get ready for my first dance, holding my hand as I waited to walk down the aisle to John. We made our way to the kitchen in silence. The half-mixed cake batter sat forgotten on the counter as I put the kettle on, falling back on the British instinct to make tea in times of crisis. "So," I said, as I set a steaming mug in front of her, "you wanted to talk." My mother wrapped her hands around the mug, staring into its depths as if she might find the right words floating in the tea. "Sarah," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been doing a lot of thinking since the party. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I want you to know, she continued, that your father and we never meant to hurt you. Or the children. We thought we were doing what was best. I felt a familiar surge of frustration. Best for whom, Mom? For you and Dad? For your image of what our family should be. She flinched at my words, but didn't back down. We wanted you to have every opportunity, every advantage. We didn't want you to struggle the way we did. But don't you see? I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to keep calm. By trying to protect us from struggle, you've created a whole different kind of pain. The pain of never feeling good enough, of always trying to live up to impossible standards. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Sarah, she said. Is that really how you feel? That you're not good enough? The raw emotion in her voice caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw not the critical, demanding mother of my adulthood, but the woman who had held me when I cried, who had cheered at my school plays, who had beamed with pride at my graduation. It's not just me, Mom, I said softly. It's all of us. Emily feels like she can never measure up to your expectations. Tommy's always trying to be the perfect grandson. And Jamie. I paused, swallowing hard. Jamie thinks you're ashamed of him. My mother's face crumpled. Ashamed? Oh, no. No, we could never be ashamed of Jamie. He's special. Yes, he is, I agreed. But not in the way you mean. He's special because he's kind and creative and sees the world in ways that amaze me every day. Not because he's different or because he needs extra help sometimes. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years of misunderstanding hanging heavy between us. I remember, my mother said suddenly, the day you told us you were pregnant with Jamie. You were so excited, so full of hopes and dreams for him. And then when he was born and the doctors started talking about developmental delays, I saw the fear in your eyes, Sarah, the worry. And I thought if we pushed him to be normal, if we treated him just like the other grandchildren, it would somehow make everything okay. I felt a lump forming in my throat. But it didn't make everything okay, did it? It just made him feel like he wasn't enough. Like we were constantly disappointed in him. My mother nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. I see that now. I see how wrong we were. But Sarah, you have to believe me, we never meant to hurt any of you. We love you all so much. I reached across the table and took her hand. I know you do, Mom. But love isn't always enough. Sometimes we have to. Look at our actions, at the impact they have, regardless of our intentions. She squeezed my hand. You're right. And I'm sorry, Sarah. Truly sorry. For all of it. The words I'd longed to hear for so many years hung in the air between us. I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, even as a new, tentative hope began to take root. So what do we do now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My mother straightened in her chair, a determined look replacing the sorrow on her face. We do better, she said firmly. We listen more. We accept more. We love without conditions or expectations. I nodded, feeling a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. It won't be easy, I warned. We've all got a lot of ingrained habits to break. No, she agreed. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. As if on cue, we heard the front door open, followed by the sound of backpacks being dropped and shoes being kicked off. Mom, Jamie's voice called out. We're home. My mother and I exchanged a look. Are you ready for this? I asked. She took a deep breath, then nodded. I'm ready to try. As Jamie and Tommy burst into the kitchen, their faces lighting up at the sight of their grandmother, I felt a surge of hope. This was just the beginning, I knew. There would be more conversations, more misunderstandings, more moments of frustration and hurt. But for the first time in years, I felt like we were on the right path. Granny, Jamie exclaimed, rushing to give her a hug. I didn't know you were coming over. I watched as my mother wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. I wanted to surprise you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I thought maybe we could all do something together this afternoon. What do you think? Jamie pulled back, his face alight with excitement. Really? Can we go to the park? I want to show you my new kite. My mother glanced at me, a question in her eyes. I nodded encouragingly. The park sounds perfect, she said, smiling at Jamie. Tommy, would you like to come too? As the boys cheered and ran off to get their things, my mother turned to me. Is this okay? She asked hesitantly. I felt tears pricking at my eyes. It's more than okay, Mum. It's a start. As we gathered our things and headed out into the warm afternoon sun, I couldn't help but feel a sense of lightness. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew. There were still conversations to be had, bridges to be rebuilt. My father, for one, would need his own reckoning with the past. But as I watched my mother laugh at Jamie's jokes, saw her genuine interest as Tommy showed off his football skills, I felt a glimmer of hope. We were taking the first steps towards healing, towards building a family based on acceptance and unconditional love rather than expectations and appearances. The confrontation that had been brewing for so long had finally come to pass. The injustices that had simmered beneath the surface for years had been unmasked. And while the process had been painful, it had also been necessary. Like lancing a wound to let it heal, we had opened up old hurts to allow for new growth. As we walked through the park, the autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet, I realized that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments of truth to face. But for now, in this moment, watching my children play with their grandmother, hearing the genuine laughter, and seeing the unguarded smiles, I felt a sense of peace. The confrontation had been hard, but it had been worth it. We had taken the first steps towards building a family where everyone could be truly seen, truly accepted, truly loved. And in that moment, under the golden afternoon sun, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world, I knew that we were going to be okay. Not perfect, not without struggles, but okay. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. The weeks following our confrontation passed in a blur of tentative conversations and cautious hope. It was as if we were all learning a new language, fumbling with unfamiliar words and phrases as we tried to express feelings long buried beneath layers of expectation and resentment. The first family dinner after the confrontation was a study in awkwardness. We gathered around my parents' dining table, the same one that had been the scene of so many tense meals and unspoken disappointments. But this time, something was different. Jamie sat between John and me, no longer relegated to the kids' table or left at home. My father, usually so quick to dominate the conversation with tales of his business triumphs, was uncharacteristically quiet. As we passed around dishes of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, I caught my mother's eye. She gave me a small, nervous smile, and I felt a surge of affection for her. This wasn't easy for any of us, but we were trying. So, Jamie, my father said suddenly, his voice gruff with an emotion I couldn't quite place. How's school going? Your mum tells me you've been doing well in your art classes. Jamie looked up, surprise clear on his face. It was rare for my father to address him directly, let alone show interest in his activities. Yeah, he said hesitantly. We're doing a project on abstract expressionism. I really like it. My father nodded, clearly out of his depth but making an effort. That's good. Maybe you could show me some of your work sometime. The smile that lit up Jamie's face was worth every uncomfortable moment, every difficult conversation we'd had to get to this point. Really? You want to see it? Of course, my father said, and I was startled to see the glimmer of tears in his eyes. I'd like that very much. As the meal progressed, I felt a warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the hearty food or the glass of red wine in front of me. This wasn't perfect, far from it. There were still moments of tension, of old habits reasserting themselves. But it was a start. After dinner, as we all pitched in to clear the table, another new development. My mother had always insisted on doing it all herself. Emily pulled me aside. "Mom," she said, her voice low. Is this for real? Or are we just pretending everything's okay now?" I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. At 15, she was on the cusp of womanhood, no longer the little girl who used to twirl in pretty dresses for her grandparents' approval. I saw the wariness in her eyes, the hope she was trying to keep in check. It's real, I said softly. Or at least, we're trying to make it real. It's not going to be perfect, love. We've all got a lot of work to do. But we're trying. She nodded, biting her lip. It's just, I don't want to get my hopes up, you know? I don't want to start believing things are different and then have it all go back to how it was before. I pulled her into a hug, feeling the tension in her shoulders. I know, sweetheart. And I can't promise it will all be smooth sailing from here. But I can promise you this, I won't let us go back to how things were. We're moving forward, all of us. Together. As the weeks turned into months, we settled into a new rhythm as a family. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of frustration, of old hurts resurfacing. But there were also moments of joy, of connection, that we'd never experienced before. My father, to everyone's surprise, took a genuine interest in Jamie's art. He even went so far as to clear out a corner of his study to display some of Jamie's paintings. The first time I saw them there, hanging proudly alongside my father's golf trophies and business awards, I felt a lump form in my throat. My mother, true to her word, made an effort to connect with each of the children on their own terms. She took Emily shopping, not to buy the clothes she thought Emily should wear, but to help Emily explore her own style. She cheered at Tommy's football matches with genuine enthusiasm, no longer comparing him to his cousins or lamenting his lack of interest in more cultured pursuits. As for John and me, we found ourselves rediscovering each other. With the weight of family expectations lifted, we were able to focus on our relationship in a way we hadn't in years. We started having date nights again, stealing moments of connection amidst the chaos of family life. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were still moments of tension, of old patterns reasserting themselves. I remember one particularly difficult Sunday lunch, about 3 months after our confrontation. We were all gathered at my parents' house, the roast in the oven filling the air with the comforting scent of sage and onion. Jamie was showing my father his latest art project, a collage he'd made in school. My father was nodding along, clearly trying to understand, but looking a bit lost. "That's interesting, Jamie," he said, his voice strained. "But don't you think it might be nice to try something a bit more traditional? Maybe a nice landscape?" I felt my hackles rise, ready to jump to Jamie's defense. But before I could say anything, my mother stepped in. "Now, David," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We talked about this. Jamie's art is his own expression. We're here to support and encourage, not to direct." My father looked chastened. "You're right, of course," he said, turning back to Jamie. "I'm sorry, lad. Tell me more about why you chose these colors." As Jamie launched into an enthusiastic explanation of his artistic choices, I caught my mother's eye. She gave me a small nod, and I felt a rush of gratitude. We were all learning, all growing. It wasn't always easy, but we were doing it together. As the months passed, I found myself reflecting on how far we'd come. The house that had once felt like a battleground of unmet expectations and silent resentments now rang with laughter and honest conversations. We weren't perfect, far from it. But we were real in a way we'd never been before. One evening, as John and I sat in the garden watching the sunset, I found myself thinking about the journey we'd been on. The confrontation that had seemed so terrifying had been the catalyst for change we'd all desperately needed. "Penny for your thoughts?" John said, squeezing my hand. I smiled, leaning into him. "Just thinking about how different things are now. How different we are." He nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "It's been quite a ride, hasn't it? There were times I wasn't sure we'd make it through. But we did," I said softly. "We're still here, still fighting, still loving." As if on cue, we heard the sound of laughter from inside the house. Jamie and Tommy were playing some video game, their excited shouts drifting out through the open window. Emily's voice chimed in, teasing them good-naturedly. "We've got good kids," John said, a note of pride in his voice. "We do," I agreed. "And they've got good grandparents now, too." Who would have thought? We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. As the first stars began to appear, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The confrontation that had seemed so daunting had been the beginning of our healing, not the end. We'd unmasked the injustices that had plagued our family for so long, and in doing so, we'd found a new way forward. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when old habits crept in, when misunderstandings threatened to derail our progress. But we'd learned to communicate, to listen, to truly see each other. We'd learned that love didn't mean perfection, but acceptance and support. As we made our way back into the house, drawn by the sounds of our children's laughter, I felt a surge of hope for the future. We weren't the perfect family I'd once desperately tried to create. We were messy and complicated and sometimes difficult. But we were real. We were honest. And we were together. The new dawn that had seemed so impossible in those dark days before the confrontation had finally arrived. And as I looked around at my family, at John's steady presence, at Emily's newfound confidence, at Tommy's infectious enthusiasm, at Jamie's beautiful, unique perspective on the world, I knew that this was just the beginning. We had unmasked the injustice, confronted our demons, and come out the other side stronger and more united than ever before. The road ahead might not always be smooth, but I knew now that we had the tools and the love to navigate whatever challenges came our way. As we gathered around the kitchen table, squabbling good-naturedly over the last slice of pizza, I felt a smile spread across my face. This was us. Imperfect, loud, sometimes chaotic, but always, always loving. And I wouldn't have it any other way. The confrontation had been the turning point, but this moment of simple, ordinary family life, this was our new dawn. And it was beautiful,